Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 13, the last chapter in our course, which is all about urban patterns. So we're going to talk about what do we mean by an urban place and how are urban places laid out. So first of all, what is urban? This is dense, large, and again, large is a relative word, right, compared to other places, right? Tierra Santa is not as large as New York City. Non-agricultural settlements. This includes suburbs and small cities. Right, so places like Tierra Santa are considered urban, as is San Francisco. Today, 50% of the world's population lives in urban environments. We crossed over this 50% threshold a few years ago, which was kind of a big deal. Mostly, this is in more developed countries. More developed countries have much higher rates of urbanization, some as high as 90%. But the most growth is seen in less developed countries. So cities, particularly in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, are growing really, really rapidly. So a recent explosion in the amount of people living in urban areas. So in 1950, there were 733 million people living in cities, and today about 3.5 billion, half of the world's population. I'm not going to talk that much about urban economics, just because we talked about that in chapter 11 and chapter 12. But just to kind of review really quick, industrial is growing in less developed countries now, located near raw materials, places like steel in Pittsburgh, or near job markets and shipping lanes. Depends on the nature of the product, whether it's bulk reducing or gaining. And this, again, this is all review from chapter 11 from the last module. In chapter 12, we talked about post-industrial or service economies, which are concentrated in more developed countries now. They exist everywhere, but concentrated in more developed countries. So where are cities located? The earliest were located, they were kind of service or political hubs for farming communities. So if you think about the earliest cities in the United States, New York, Chicago, right, definitely located near kind of shipping um, and uh, uh, and they were also political hubs. Also defensive sites, particularly in Europe, you have a lot of places that are defensive sites. Modern cities are located near trade, right? Places where you can have shipping happening, crossroads of railroads and roads and shipping lanes. This has changed a little bit due to the internet and service economies, but not actually that much. There's a bunch of different examples here of kind of where defensive sites are located versus trade sites. You can read more about that in your book, but I'm not going to go over it here. But basically, near resources, some type of resource. And the names can give you a clue. When we think about places like Riverside or Great Falls or Colorado Springs or Grand Rapids, right? These are all located near water, and they were named as such. When we look at city structure, which is how cities are put together, and different cities are put together differently, we think about land use patterns. Are we looking at kind of commercial districts, residential districts, industrial districts, public space? We can also look at the income and economic patterns, the transportation patterns, and this differs around the world, and I'll talk about this a little bit. And it also differs with the age of cities. Newer cities are laid out differently than old cities. We have something called the Central Business District, which we refer to kind of colloquially as downtown. In this, I'll call it Central Business District, or CBD. This is a clustering of services that have a high range and threshold. Remember last chapter I talked about range and threshold, but these are basically they need quite a few people to sustain them, but people will also travel farther to get to them. They are a centralizing force in a city. They are very dense. They usually have very high rents. They are usually a hub of transportation. And think about San Diego for this, right? It's pretty expensive to live downtown. It's pretty dense, and the trolley runs right through there. There's typically fewer residents and more businesses. San Diego is the exception to this. We have not a lot of people in San Diego work downtown. We are kind of an oddball in this situation. When we look at residential neighborhoods, they are income based or class based. Your book talks about class based, lower class, middle class, upper class. I don't really enjoy that term. I prefer income based, but it certainly is also can be based upon race and ethnicity as well, which I'll touch upon briefly. But more desirable areas have higher costs and higher rents, which makes sense. What is desirable differs around the world, right? Steep hillsides in San Francisco, you have mansions. Steep hillsides in Rio, you have lower income housing. When we look at North American cities, the earliest cities near the central business district is the most desirable place to be. In industrial cities, you had factories near city centers. Um, and then you had this process of deindustrialization and then suburbanization. So if you think about a place like Detroit, which built a lot of cars, then built a lot less cars, you had something called white flight, a lot of people leaving the city, moving out to the suburbs. So you have that inner city decline that took place. Um, we also have auto-oriented cities, which is really kind of unique to the United States. Not to say that there's not cars all over the world, but we are really an auto-oriented country. So we have all of this kind of separation of land use. Nobody lives downtown, although this is changing. And again, San Diego is the exception to this. Generally speaking, in the United States, less accessible areas were more desirable. Those suburbs, right, were more desirable than those downtown areas. But the new trend is that people are returning to downtown. Having models of American city structure, the first one being this concentric zone model where you have a central business district followed by a zone of transition, followed by workers' homes, followed by better residences, and then this commuter zone on the outskirts, right? So everything kind of feeds out from that central business district. Then you have the sector model where basically it's not kind of based upon that ring, but you have a central business district. Then you have kind of different sectors that are happening here. So you have a transportation and industry sector here. It doesn't necessarily need to be laid out by this. It's an example, but it is not a concentric zone model, right? So here you have low class residential that's near downtown. Then you have a high class residential. And then the other type is multiple nuclei model, which means that you have different hubs of different places. So you can see you have a central business district here, but you also have a hub right here, which is an outlying business district. And then you have what is 6 here, heavy manufacturing happening over here. So right, you have multiple centers. You still have that central business district, but you have multiple centers kind of happening in the same city. Los Angeles is an example of a multi-nuclei city. So, for example, you have downtown Hollywood, downtown LA, the Westwood skyline, which is near UCLA, right? Multiple kind of hubs. In the real world, no city fits any model perfectly. Most cities display kind of a combination of the 3 models. So you could look at San Diego and say, here's a central business district. There's kind of transition, middle income, better residents. So you can kind of get this zone. But then you can also see these kind of different sectors that are happening: higher income, middle income, lower income, industry and transportation. And so when we think about what are some of the nuclei in San Diego County, other than the central business district, like we could think of places like UTC, which is definitely an important area of business. In European cities, lots of them are pre-industrial, they're pre-automobile, so near the central business district is most desirable. That's kind of the old city. It's access to jobs and amenities, old pretty buildings. Factories were never there. And then factories and housing for workers were built on the edge of the city, in these kind of usually like socialist planning. So especially in Eastern Europe, you get this kind of communist bloc housing that happens. In European cities, those suburbs are associated with lower class or lower income and immigrants. Usually that's where your housing projects are going to be. They're going to be in the suburbs. Um, American style central business districts kind of built away from those centers a little bit differently. In Latin American cities, they were founded by the Spanish and Portuguese. So there were cities there before, but they were pretty much demolished during colonization. Um, but you have a central plaza, um, which is in the central business district. It's the focus of religious, political, and social life. And then you have older, desirable neighborhoods near that plaza, and then squatter settlements on the periphery. So this is due to a lot of rural to urban migration that's happening. People coming in and looking for work. They're not being affordable housing for them, so they're building this housing kind of on the outskirts of the city. In African cities, they were also founded by Europeans. Again, it's not to say that there were not, cities or large settlements before Europeans showed up, but those were taken over and for the most part erased. So African cities are generally newer. They generally have modern central business districts. Um, but there's a lot of uneven development. So where you have a very modern downtown, but then again, like in Latin American cities, on the outskirts, this more informal housing. We also have primate cities, these mega cities like Accra, Ghana, that are expanding very, very rapidly and a lot less developed around the edges of that city. Slums are very, very common. Cityscapes is what does a city look like and feel? If you've traveled at all, if you've traveled to different cities, right? San Diego has a very different feel than Boston or New York. I'm originally from the East Coast, and San Diego is entirely different to me. Architecture plays a big role, right? We can think about here's Greenwich Village in New York City, right? You're not going to see much building like this in San Diego. It's generally always changing. The market kind of demands change. New things come in, new things are exciting. Some locations are resistant to change, and they retain their value as is. But if you look at here's Times Square in 1970, here's Times Square now. Times Square when I was a kid was not a very safe place to walk around, and now there's a huge M&M store there. An example of this are hutongs in Beijing, which are like these little kind of alleyways in Beijing with all these businesses. And so generally speaking, what's happening, especially because there's a communist government there that can kind of do what they want, right? You can see this older part of the city and then building this really modern part of the city, demolishing parts of this stuff to build these things. So you have this kind of weird interdispersed thing happening, but more and more of this disappearing. Suburbanization is when cities grow outward and not upward, right? And this is definitely the case in Southern California. Our cities expanded out and not up. If you think about the amount of tall buildings that are in New York versus the amount of tall buildings that are in San Diego, very, very different. This is almost uniquely American. This happened post World War II. Everyone has cars now. And so when you have that deindustrialization happens, those factories closing in cities, central cities become less desirable, and it led to this multiple nuclei happening. This is a decentralizing force. This is things pushing people away from the central business district. The central business district is less relevant now. So when we look at San Diego, right, we have downtown and everything, but if you live in Poway, you have your own services in Poway, right? There's very little other than to go to a Padres game that you're going to have to go to downtown San Diego for. So when we look at places like the outskirts of Wichita, Kansas, right, we have lots of suburban development. If you look at satellite imagery, these kind of things that look kind of like, they're called loop and lollipops, but this is all suburban development. And we have problems with suburban sprawl. It is problematic outward growth, and I'll talk about why it's problematic. San Diego has an urban growth boundary where we are not supposed to really build big developments beyond based upon our master plan. San Diego is now focusing on infill and growing up rather than out. We have problems with leapfrog development where basically you have, rather than kind of going out from a central zone, you will skip over large areas, and this just causes freeway congestion in between. People driving long distances, everything is really private. There's kind of no connectivity between these places. right? So if you look at like Las Vegas, right, here you have a development, here you have a development, here you have a development, right? They're not even connected to one each other. The costs of urban sprawl are more pollution per capita. Generally speaking, we're all driving somewhere. We got to drive pretty far to get there. You lose a lot of time in your car, right? That's time that could be spent at home or at work. Um, I spend a lot of time in the car because I have to drive all over the place to teach. And, generally speaking, I try to make the most of it. I listen to lots of podcasts and books on tape and I listen to the news. But generally speaking, that's time lost that I could be working to help the economy. And it's also time lost with my family, right? Longer journeys to work leads to all kinds of social and health problems. You also habitat loss, right? You're destroying more of the natural environment. You have increased infrastructure costs, so you have to maintain all of those highways and roads. Also, a decreased sense of community. Um, this doesn't happen everywhere, but generally speaking, if you live in a gated community, how well are you knowing your neighbors immediately outside of those gates or even within those gates sometimes, right? As opposed to when you live in kind of a more urban, walkable area where you're talking to your neighbors more on the regular, right? Potentially less social interaction. Also, more segregation. Suburbanization has really led to, different ethnicities living in different places, a loss of aesthetics, right? A lot of people don't like the look of this. Every house looks the same going down the street, as opposed to kind of those beautiful kind of homes and kind of unique architecture that you get in central business districts and downtown areas. Can also lead to things like less pride and lower property values. It also leads to jurisdictional complexity, which is we in San Diego have something called the San Diego Association of Governments that helps kind of combat that. But if you look at Los Angeles County here, right, you have some unincorporated areas, lots of different municipalities that are all kind of butted up against each other with some unincorporated areas in between, freeways traveling through them. So it's kind of hard to accomplish tasks that are needed for the community. There's been a lot of backlash against urban sprawl, and so um, the kind of call for that is urban renewal. And this is to make central business districts, urban centers more important and attractive again. We did this in San Diego, where we now have Petco Park that's right downtown. It's built right in the middle of downtown to bring people downtown. Lots of restaurants and stuff around downtown, made downtown a tourist destination again. Right, infill development, so kind of filling in where you have space rather than moving out. Things like adaptive reuse. This is a building in North Park in San Diego that was a post office, and now I believe there's some businesses in here. There's a pizza place over here. I believe there's apartments up top that are quite pricey. Left up the U.S. Post Office sign because it looks nice and swanky. More pedestrian zones. Here's a street mall in Denver, right where the bus can come down, but that's it. Urban renewal can lead to gentrification, though. Gentrification happens because there is a rent gap, and basically a neighborhood's actual rents that people are paying fall below those potential rents. This has been happening all over San Diego for quite some time. South Park in San Diego, which is pretty expensive to live in, when I first moved here, was considered a relatively affordable neighborhood. People with money move in, they invest, and those rents go up even higher. This is a very big problem in San Francisco. You're going to see it. You're going to watch a video on that after you watch this. The good, and I'm even hesitant to say the good of gentrification, it revitalizes the neighborhood economy, right? It brings a lot of money in. The bad is it displaces people with few economic resources. And generally speaking, you're going to watch a video about the mission. And if you've taken my sustainability class, I apologize, you've already seen this video, but it's worth even watching twice because it's so good. But you're displacing people with few economic resources that really kind of made a place their own. So think about places like Barrio Logan, which is fighting against gentrification right now. This is Red Hook, Brooklyn, and you can look at the gentrification that's happened there. So in 2000, you had a large number of Latino and African Americans living down there, and many, many, many of them have been displaced. by a lot of wealthier white people who are moving in. So generally speaking, urban renewal is hard because it generally does not help the people who are already living there. Those people get shoved out and pushed someplace else. Just to give you an idea of some kind of like other ways which people are trying to deal with some of these problems of suburban sprawl, new urbanism is a kind of a housing plan style that basically it's new development, but it's creating small towns in the suburbs. So basically, you're going to build a development, but it's going to be pretty self-sustaining. It's going to be mixed use. So things like this, where you have a nail spa and you have apartments on top, right? This is pretty a big part of new urbanism, and it's dense. These houses are touching, right? So not to have these huge streets, lots of property, very interconnected, very walkable. Um, it's supposed to be connected through to the rest of the region through transit. Ideally, it's mixed income, but it's usually wealthier people who get on waiting lists to live in these new urbanist developments. Disney's Town Celebration is a new urbanist development. So high demand equals high cost. We think about affordable housing and homelessness. We have a huge we've had a huge spike in the homeless population in San Diego that has built since the economic collapse that happened in 2008. We are trying a variety of ways to deal with it, but part of the reason that this exists is that development is for profit. Generally speaking, when people are building new homes, it is they will make the most money by building the most expensive thing that the market can bear. This is even true for governments. So little to no affordable housing is built, and this increases the homeless population. We have 3 million people in the US today that are homeless. Public housing, which is this picture on the top here, which is often referred to as the projects, is increasingly rare. Um, so governments are trying to pass laws mandating developments to make affordable housing, but it is very hard. It is economically undesirable by businesses. Those ordinances are hard to pass. And generally speaking, too, nobody wants affordable housing located near them for that NIMBY attitude that not in my backyard, that if you have affordable housing, you're going to have increases in crime. We also have lots of suburban poverty. So during the housing crisis of 2008, suburban homes lost an incredible amount of value, and so it was more affordable option for many to go buy a house in the suburbs and have your extended family live with you. Not all suburbs declined, but lots did. So if you look at the suburbs here, in El Cajon, you have nearly a quarter of the population that's living below the poverty line in a suburb. I believe this is the last thing that I'm going to talk about, but urban transportation and mobility. So it is a mode to get from A to B, right? For most of us, the car is the only choice that we have. I would love to take the train to work. I would be overjoyed to take the train to work or even the bus to work. But it is not economically feasible for me, and it is not time feasible for me. Um, Public transportation requires density to profit. And often people are afraid of public transportation. They are nervous about riding public transportation. This is very, very different from a lot of Europe and much of the world. But a lot of people get worried about riding public transportation, that they're going to get lost, that there's higher crime. Walking and biking difficult given the distance and the infrastructure. I certainly could not walk or bike to work either. European cities are very, very well suited for both. It is very difficult to change this. People need a big incentive not to drive. The Sprinter is great, but it is pretty darn expensive. And it has, you have to make sure that it's going to stop when you need it to. It has to be in your budget. In London, right, they give people incentives not to drive, right? They charge you for congestion during downtown on Monday through Friday from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. We also have problems with parking. And what I mean by problems with parking is that we have too much parking. Most parking is free and easy, right? If you look at Mission Valley, there are a lot of parking lots. Some municipal codes demand that you have a really large parking lot. Developers demand it. It takes up a huge amount of land and it incentivizes driving. So if you think about if you're going to Petco Park for a game, it's pretty darn expensive to park down there. There's going to be a lot of traffic getting out of down there. So maybe you will ride the trolley into downtown for that game because it's easier for you. But when you're going to IKEA, you could technically ride the trolley. I understand you might be buying a piece of furniture, and possibly that's a bad example. But if you're going to any shopping in Mission Valley, right, you're probably less likely to take public transportation there. This is Hartford, Connecticut, which is the capital of the state I grew up in. And a lot of cities, too, have converted a lot of land into parking. So the red here is surface parking lots in 2000. I'm sorry, 1960, excuse me, and then 2000 over here. Lots more surface parking lots, so people are kind of disincentivized to ride public transportation into downtown. And also think about where are the jobs, right? There's a disconnect between residences and jobs. There's a mismatch of residential rent and local wages. If you are working at serving food in downtown, you certainly cannot afford to live downtown, right? So people tend to have very long commutes and unidirectional traffic congestion. I know in Southern California we have some pretty terrible traffic. I dread if I wind up leaving at a certain time from a certain school. That is the end of chapter 13 and the last lecture of the class. You're going to watch a short, not that short actually, but I think 18-minute video on gentrification after this.